Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. In this first hour, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news, and it's going to be kind of all over the map. We're going to talk about why is it that COVID-19 seems to strike some people more than others, and the effects are very different. Science Magazine thinks it may have an answer to that, and it makes sense to me. It makes sense to Dr. Anthony Fauci and a variety of other researchers, so it's probably true, but you just never know, because this is a novel coronavirus, so even the speculation based on very good evidence could be wrong, but I think we've got a pretty good answer for that, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Then I've posted a couple of articles, one by Dennis Prager. His argument is America's in real danger, and he helps us understand why is it that in other countries the totalitarian temptation has been so great. I mean, really, if you think about this, we have had people here trying to promote Nazism, trying to promote communism, and we even have a socialist candidate for president who didn't do that well, and yet overseas in Europe they always have taken over all in so many different ways, especially after World War I and then again after World War II. So we'll get into that in just a bit. And, of course, then I'm not going to ignore Kamala Harris, because, after all, she is the vice presidential nominee. And we've got a couple of pieces here, one by Ben Shapiro, another very interesting one, which I thought was very well written, that appeared in what is called The Federalist, on the fact that Kamala Harris is not a moderate, which, if nothing else, would be a warning for the fact that when you see something in the press, and we certainly saw a lot of people yesterday trying to make the case that she's a moderate, maybe a left of center, but still pretty much a moderate, middle of the road, which is so inaccurate, as we mentioned yesterday with Tim Wildman, but I've got some more specific data to really set that aside. And just a reminder again that you need to read widely. I mean, don't just read conservative things that you agree with. Don't just read Christian things you agree with. Don't just read, as the other side oftentimes does, liberal, secular, progressive things and think that that's the end of it all, because sometimes certain stories, as we'll be talking about today, just never get covered. So that's just a brief overview of a few things we're going to get into in this hour. Next hour, in studio with me, Sean Dunn. He's with Groundwire. You might say, never heard of it. Well, that's understandable. But the Jesus Cares outreach has been very dynamic. And if you have a desire to reach out to the millennial generation, as we do, we're next Tuesday going to have a millennial roundtable around this table here. Reach out to the Generation Z, as we have talked about before with Shane Pruitt and some others. I mean, these are just important issues, and he will be here talking about what they have been doing through just incredible videos that show up on the computers and especially the cell phones. 84% of millennials are never more than 10 feet away from their cell phone. That's an incredible statistic, which we'll recount again when he's in studio. Then in the next hour, if you happen to want to join us, Spencer Klavan will be with us. I guess I say Klavan is the way he's saying it these days. There's an Andrew Klavan and a Spencer Klavan. I've never figured out if they're related, but I've been reading Andrew Klavan for some time. Matter of fact, I've got a very good article right next to me here that he wrote that I may turn into a commentary. And then Spencer may or may not be related, but nevertheless is a graduate from Yale University in the classics and was one of those drama people. So we'll enjoy chatting with him. And then got his doctorate from Oxford and is actually got a new podcast out called Young Heretics. So I thought it'd be interesting to you. And then I'll get back into some of the news. But just before we take a break, let me do my obligatory coronavirus pandemic. and that is the real big puzzle. Why is it, as you have seen before, now maybe more and more of us have had friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members, business associates, whatever, that have come down with COVID-19. And you see some that go, it was like the common cold. Some say, I had it and didn't even know I had it. And others are on ventilators in the hospital. What is that all about? Now, one piece of evidence, which is not in this article I'm going to quote from, is we recognize there are different strains. Some of them are more severe than others. So that may be sufficient enough to answer that question. But an article that just was published in Science magazine is one that Dr. Anthony Fauci's been talking about, because it found that people might have potential immunity if they were exposed to some other coronavirus. And so in some respects, that's kind of intriguing. So that means that if in the past you had access to, it could be just as simple as the common cold, it certainly could be some of the more endemic coronavirus strains. That would be SARS or MERS or things like that, that there seems to be, can I get technical just a minute here, T-cell cross-reactivity. Okay, you might say, okay, that's too technical. Well, there's two ways in which, and I love in this article, it really kind of goes into it, there's two ways your body fights disease. One is obviously through the antibodies. That's kind of your first line of defense. And that's kind of, your troops, to use a military term, those are the troops on the front line. And so they prevent a virus from getting in. And so that's kind of the first line of defense. But interestingly enough, if indeed you get an infection, then your T cells, which are very important indeed, which originate in your thymus. That's why you need to have a good thymus gland, actually is a secondary line of defense. Now, here's the other part of it, which I'm not going to try to get too technical for. Your antibody resistance over time tends to fade. Your T cells tend to stay a little bit longer. Now, they don't last forever. That was one of the things Anthony Fauci points out. T cells last much longer than antibodies, but they don't last forever. That's his quote. The more recently an individual, of course, has been infected with some other kind of coronavirus, the greater likelihood of some kind of protection. And one more quote from Anthony Fauci, and then we'll dismiss the Biology 101 or Epidemiology 101 class for this morning. But if nothing else, Anthony Fauci said it's sort of like a 1-2 punch. It's conceivable that the T cells that you've made in response a couple of years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, when you were exposed to a relatively benign coronavirus that causes the common cold, could actually hang around when you're exposed to the SARS coronavirus 2 and could have some degree of protection. So it's an interesting theory. It seems based upon what we are already observing with different individuals. And so I would certainly say this is one possible explanation. I would add it to one that's not in this paper, but one we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and that is there seems to be as many as a half a dozen different strains of the coronavirus. And so as a result, it is possible that if you got a light strain, that is not going to affect you as much as a strain that is much more virulent. And they did notice a difference between those that had the light strain who rarely got on a ventilator and those who had the heavy strain, the very virulent one, they were much more likely to do so. Still, that was on the level of like, I think, 10 or 11%. But still, the difference between 1% and 11%, especially if you're in that 11%, is pretty significant. So I would put the two of those together, and it's just one more piece that we're starting to learn about this pandemic. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about first why America's in danger. What about this pick of Joe Biden? Ben Shapiro says it was a risky one indeed, maybe an awful one is probably his words, and we'll explain maybe what that means in terms of this presidential election, knowing that this time next week, the Democratic convention will be coming to an end, and we'll be having a chance to hear the speech by former Vice President Joe Biden. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The
Let me start with an important question. Should teachers be considered essential workers? Over the last few months, we have designated police officers and firefighters, along with doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals as essential workers. We've even designated grocery workers, delivery drivers, food processors, and truck drivers as essential. These people, and many others we could list, went to their jobs every day. Some complained, but most considered the potential risks and did what they could to prevent catching the coronavirus. We owe these people a tremendous debt of gratitude. By contrast, lots of public school teachers and the teachers' unions are resisting any attempt to reopen the schools. There have been petitions and even protests. That's why most schools will be closed this fall. We closed down school systems months ago because we assumed that children would be the most vulnerable group during a pandemic. We now know that children are the least vulnerable to the virus. The American Academy of Pediatricians advocated that schools have a goal of having students physically present in schools. The New England Journal of Medicine warns that children living in poverty, children of color, English language learners, children with diagnosed disabilities, and young children face especially severe losses. Will some teachers be more at risk than others if schools reopen? That's possible, but one survey found that only 17% of public school teachers are in the vulnerable age range of 55 or older. This could be managed. Public schools in other countries in Europe and in Australia have been able to do this successfully. For years, we've been told that educating the next generation is essential. So why shouldn't governors, mayors, and school administrators designate teachers as essential workers? It is a question that I suggest you ask them, especially during this election season. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about my first article that we've posted here by Dennis Prager. You've probably figured out by now that he sometimes becomes our go-to individual, and so because of that, when this came out 2 days ago, I kind of set it aside, and I said, well, maybe I'll get to it later, because it's like I sometimes feel like we overdo the Dennis Prager material, but it's so insightful that I just couldn't resist, and it's basically titled, Why America is in Real Danger. And when you read into it, he's giving you a history lesson, but also, now he's looking at this obviously from an Orthodox Jew's perspective. I'm looking at it from an evangelical Christian's perspective. It makes the case even more so that we need revival in America, because if not, this is the end of America as we know it. And the reason he would maybe agree with some of that, and the reason I say that, let's go through the article, and it's on for about 3 pages, and I'm going to summarize it because, again, you can read it and see the force of the argument. But the point he's making is that America and Americans have been proud of the fact that, unlike European countries, we in this country never had, if you will, we never walked down the road or the route of totalitarianism as we have seen in Europe, communism, fascism, and Nazism. But then the argument, which is arresting by Dennis Prager, is this achievement may be coming to an end. And the reason for this is that certain European countries fell victim to totalitarian doctrines for very good reasons. 2, Number one, if you had Judeo-Christian values, which we did in America, and if you had patriotism, love of one's nation, then that really almost became, since I was just using a medical illustration, almost like an antidote, almost like a protection, or if you want to use a military term, almost like a shield to prevent those caustic, toxic ideas from coming to this country. And yet, in a very real sense, he points out that after World War I, you had this slaughter of millions, the ending of any belief in Christianity. And so religion in many of these European countries after World War I was deemed as unnecessary. And, of course, the national identity was seen as the cause of the Great War, World War I. So his argument is this left a void that was immediately filled with communism, fascism, and Nazism. I'll skip over the obvious. If you know anything about history, you know how we went from the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks to communism. You probably know a little bit about, after World War II, the rise of fascism in Italy, the rise, of course, Nazism in Germany, and all the rest. And the point that he makes is really powerful because those filled a void. But unlike those individuals in those countries and those various toxic kinds of ideologies, he says Americans did not lose their faith in Judeo-Christian religions and values or in America after World War I. Matter of fact, America became so religious that in 1954, the words "under God" were inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, which, of course, was cited every single day. But then he points out that by the time you get to the end of the World War II and you have this baby boom that began to move through society, then faith in America, faith in Christianity, and even what you might call the bourgeoisie, middle-class values pretty much was limited to the older Americans. But the baby boomers were kind of rejecting that, especially in the 1960s, and at the same time, they were being indoctrinated in a lot of the schools in secularism and anti-Americanism. And so then he gives some examples from his own experience going to Columbia University in the early 1970s and all the rest. We'll skip over that again. But then he comes to the obvious question. What will happen to America if Americans lose faith in God and country as the Europeans did after World War I? What will happen to America when Christianity dies as it did in Europe after World War I? And I think you can kind of see the answer of where he's taking us. And then talks about how we already have more kind of totalitarian ideas. And he uses his own examples there, talking about testifying in Congress about the fact that even back then you had 100 different Prager University or PragerU videos that were on a restricted list. Then points out that last week PragerU was locked up in its Twitter account simply because they retweeted the press conference of those physicians that we've talked about here on Point of View. And then he talks about the cancel culture, which, again, has people, in many cases, forced to either have humiliating public recantations or have to go through re-education sessions. And he says, of course, we don't have re-education camps like you do in China, but he doesn't hold out for the possibility that might not happen. And so then he adds one more to the conversation, and that is also what is happening in America is the rewriting of American past. And, of course, we've talked about that with the 1619 Project and with just the whole revisionist history that has taken place in America. And he says there's an old famous dissident joke. In the Soviet Union, the future is known. It is the past that's always changing because they were rewriting the past. So the point he's making, and it's a pretty compelling voice, I might say, is that in some respects, if indeed we find ourselves in a world where Christianity is replaced, it will be replaced by something, and it may not be communism, fascism, or Nazism. I'm pretty sure that what it would be socialism. But something has to fill the void, and that kind of fanatical attempt to do so is probably illustrated by some of the things that we have seen happening in the universities for years and now happening out on the streets here in America. Let's, just before we take a break, mention another one of the articles that I've posted here, and that is by Ben Shapiro, who reminds us that really for over a year, the Vice President Joe Biden has had pretty much of a simple strategy: be non-threatening. It's one of those things when your enemy is destroying himself, just step back and watch it happen. And his argument is that this all has been unfolding. It hasn't been positive for Donald Trump. And so he pretty much stayed in the basement and sort of just played defense against Donald Trump. But sooner or later, he had to pick a vice president. And usually, as Ben Shapiro points out, vice presidential pick means little or nothing. It's a powerless office. Rarely do presidents hand over much power to the vice presidents, but Joe Biden will be 78 and appears to be slipping mentally, as he points out. And so when you are talking about trying to pick a VP, he made a real big mistake, Ben Shapiro says, by first saying that he was going to pick a woman and then being pressured to eventually say he was going to pick a black woman. Well, that narrowed the list down so significantly, and Ben Shapiro in this article gives you the short list, and it is a very short list, and none of them really stand out. But he says none of these particular picks would be great, some far worse than others, but the one pick he says that would be the worst of all is Senator Kamala Harris, and that is she's so radical that now trying to be non-threatening doesn't work so well as a campaign theme. And he goes through the short list, which we'll get into more in detail after the break when we go and read from this piece from the Federalist. But again, she has endorsed Medicare for all. She would move Americans away from their private health plans. She openly announced that she would use executive orders to ban so-called assault weapons. She would ban fracking. She attacked Justice Brett Kavanaugh as a rapist. She attacked another judge for his Catholicism. She's unpopular, interesting enough, he says, with black Americans because as a prosecutor, she was fond of pursuing heavy sentences for light charges, as well as civil asset forfeiture. She bragged about smoking marijuana during her campaign. She's alienated, he says, moderates, attacking Biden himself as a vicious racist for his unwillingness to support forced busing and suggesting she believed Biden's bizarre sexual behavior is something. And the conclusion that Ben Shapiro makes is nothing about Senator Kamala Harris screams non-threatening. In fact, if just the opposite. And so he concludes that in selecting Harris, Biden has opened the door to the Trump campaign, and Trump should take full advantage of it. And I'm sure that would be the case. But for a campaign that was portrayed as being moderate and primarily non-threatening, and the rational alternative to this man out of control Donald Trump in the Oval Office, this didn't exactly reinforce those values. And so I think that Ben Shapiro, as always, has begun to put his finger on it. But as I read through that list, some of you might say, is that a fair assessment of the now presumptive vice presidential nominee? And that brings us to one of the other articles that we've posted here, because this is a very good and thoughtful piece that came out of the Federalist, in matter of fact, from the managing editor of the Federalist, Joshua Lawson, in which he goes into a little more detail and challenges this idea that we see right now in the press about the fact that Kamala Harris is a pragmatic moderate. I think you'll see after we take a break, she's anything but. We'll be right back.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can answer the question, is Senator Kamala Harris a moderate as she is being portrayed? But the theme that's going to run through not only this article we've posted, but one that I'm going to quote from in just a minute, is read other pieces of information. Read widely and don't necessarily just accept what you have heard from one particular source. There is a real problem with what we have oftentimes referred to as confirmation bias. I live in my little silo. I only read the things that I agree with, and I never hear a contrary point of view. And I think one of the things that would be helpful is to go to one of these internet aggregators. Of course, Drudge Report is probably the best known, but another one that I found very helpful is Real Clear Politics, which will pull things from Fox News, it will pull things from the Washington Examiner, maybe National Review, but it's also pulling stuff from Vox and from, Mother Jones and from Slate and all sorts of others. And just the other day, I was telling my producer, Steve, you had one article that says, we cannot send the kids to school, right next to one that says, let's send the kids to school. So you kind of get the point-counterpoint that's really important. And there is bias, and bias sometimes comes by not reporting all the facts or simply ignoring whole stories. And so that's part of the issue that you need to pay attention to. Now, that being said, as I look at this over these years, I will say that oftentimes the bias shows up a lot more on the liberal progressive side, and there's a very good reason for it, which we've talked about before. That is, if you start from a Christian point of view and believe that God's word is true, then anybody that's going to stray from it is going to have to deny reality. Yesterday we had Tim Wildman on. He was saying, it's so funny that the so-called party of science wants to deny that there's such a thing as boys and girls, or that there's a difference between male and female, or that an individual can be anything he or she wants to be, and if I today feel like a girl, I can be a girl. Of course, denying the reality of the fact there's a human being inside the womb, and you go down the long, long list. So oftentimes that is the case. And so I just want to encourage you to read widely. Don't necessarily believe everything we say. We work really hard to try to give you some perspectives that you need to know about. And if the argument that a Christian is using or a conservative is using doesn't make sense, I'm going to tell you, because I don't want you to go out using it and thinking you got a sword in your hand and it's a paper knife. So, this is what we want to try to do to help you understand that you right now are facing an attempt by the press to completely misrepresent some facts. And one of those is the Associated Press. Two writers for the Associated Press talked about the centrist record of Senator Kamala Harris. Then, as I've mentioned more than once, I mentioned it yesterday, mentioned again today, the New York Times immediately announced that she was a pragmatic moderate. And then you had some others refer to Harris and Biden as two moderates who share center-left politics. So what are the facts? This particular article goes into it in more detail. Tim Wildman yesterday said that he concluded, based on some survey that he was looking at, that Senator Kamala Harris is the fourth most liberal senator in the United States Senate. So has almost the most liberal voting record. I would have to even disagree with that and say that the most recent information I have in front of me right now, which you can read for yourself and check it out, is a detailed assessment done by VoteView, in which they say that the voting record for Senator Kamala Harris is further to the left than 97% of the Democrats in the Senate, or put a better way, she is more liberal than 99% of the Senate. So that makes her right to the furthest left, along with Senator Elizabeth Warren, and makes her more liberal in terms of her voting record than even Bernie Sanders. Now, have you read any of that in the Washington Post, the New York Times? Have you seen any broadcast, MSNBC, CNN, pick your particular... By the way, have you even seen that in the Washington Times, the New York Post, or even Fox News. I mean, just think about this. I mean, when you talk about liberal, and again, a lot of people don't care. I remember 12 years ago on this program having very good documentation that Senator Barack Obama was one of the most liberal members of the United States Senate. And a lot of people said, I don't care. And so I understand that. But the point is that if you look at any objective evaluation of voting record, and I think that's important, because you can say all sorts of things, but when push comes to shove, do you vote yay or nay? What do you vote for? And she is the most liberal, or shares the spot of the most liberal, with people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, and apparently a little more liberal than Senator Bernie Sanders. And I'll have to see what votes she had that were different than his. That's not moderate, okay, by any stretch of the imagination. As we've said before on this program, I quote so often from former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you are certainly free to have your own opinions, but you're not free to have your own facts. And the facts are she's not a moderate. Okay, you might say, well, I want a little more evidence of that. Okay, well, this article goes into such detail in that regard, in which she stated that individuals who are here illegally, illegal immigrants, are not illegal. They're not criminals. And so right off the bat, that's the case. She has likened the Customs Enforcement, ICE, as members of the Ku Klux Klan. If you'd like to see that video clip, it was played last night on Tucker Carlson, so you can watch it there. It's pretty easy to find out on YouTube. You don't have to trust me for that one. As a matter of fact, there is a link on this article that we've given to you, and you can follow it and see it yourself. During the debate, a question was asked, of course, during the Democratic presidential debate, how many would actually support government-run health plan going to illegal immigrants. Of course, she raised her hand there. Also, in an interview she did with Jake Tapper, which again last night was, I'm pretty sure, was shown on Tucker Carlson. You can see it there. But again, we have a link for you to follow it for yourself. She also made this statement that she's opposed to any policy with denying our country, any human being, that'd be illegal aliens and all the rest, access to public safety, public health, public education, and all the rest. She's a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. If you've listened to this program at all, you know exactly what the Green New Deal is. She was a co-sponsor of Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All, and is on record of basically wanting to repeal the tax cuts that were implemented back in 2017. Are you getting a sense of where we're going? I mean, I can go on. Let me give you 3 or 4 more, and then we'll call it a day on Kamala Harris. But I just want you to understand that when you hear the word moderate, that sounds like it's been thought through and like it really represents an accurate assessment of a voting record and of positions, and it doesn't. Let's take a couple more. She also, as we've talked about on this program, promised that if she was elected president, she would sign an executive order banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And that was one where even there was a counterpoint between, at that time, presidential candidate Joe Biden and presidential candidate Kamala Harris, in which she just dismissed this idea that the Constitution wouldn't allow her to do that. At a CNN town hall meeting, she also said that she was in favor of banning both fracking, which has given us something like energy independence, and offshore drilling. She also has proposed energy policies that are about as extreme as possible. Matter of fact, she has a climate plan for the people, and that would require us to be at 100% carbon neutral by 2030, which, first of all, is physically impossible, but politically untenable and economically disaster. And then on an issue that I know many of you are concerned about, abortion. She's anything but a moderate, as he says here. She has gone so far to propose a new plan that would somehow force states and localities to seek prior approval and clearance through the U.S. Department of Justice before they could place any limit or restriction on abortion. That would be things like 24-hour waiting period, informed consent, a variety of other issues. So we are talking about somebody who is much more extreme than many of the other Democratic nominees that have actually either run for the presidency or in some cases have won. When we say around this table that it's unlikely that Bill Clinton could actually be nominated by this Democratic Party, And while the other day we had even Tim Wildman suggesting he wasn't even sure that the Barack Obama of 2008 could be nominated, although, again, I think most of the time he was trying to hide some of the things he really believed about marriage and abortion and a variety of other topics because he just knew those would not sell. That, I think, tells you how much more radical the party has become and how much more radical Kamala Harris is, and she doesn't fit into the category of moderate. So again, that's another article that we've posted. I would encourage you, number one, read the 3 pages, and then there are all sorts of links to various videos and various other articles so that you can say, okay, I've done my research. If somebody challenges me and a conversation, or I post this on Facebook, say, well, just follow the links. This is an accurate assessment of who she is. And you need to read widely because you wouldn't know that if you just read the New York Times or the Associated Press. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes in studio with us next hour will be Sean Dunn as we talk about outreach to the millennial generation and Generation Z. I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. Spencer Klavan will be with us the hour after that, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. And I thought I might end this segment by talking about sports journalists for just a minute. Now, again, sports journalists are allowed to have opinions like anybody else, but it has been interesting to me to see how many many of the individuals, generally if they're somewhat conservative or Christian, maybe they use that to promote Christianity. And, of course, you know the criticism that has come down on the part of a few coaches and players in that regard. But most of the time, what's been happening lately is various coaches, and we're going to talk about Greg Popovich in just a minute, but we can talk about some others I've mentioned before that make some pretty outlandish statements. And this one is illustrative of the commentary that I had yesterday. My commentary yesterday, you might know, was Hands Up, Don't Shoot. And this is Jason Whitlock. If you're not familiar with Jason Whitlock, yeah, he's been a sports broadcaster and commentator, mostly commentator, I might just say. Kansas City Star, ESPN, Fox Sports, Outkick, just a variety of others. But he's out there. By the way, African-American, okay? So I want you to hear what he has to say. And he starts with this. He said, 6 years ago, I bought the Michael Brown Hands Up, Don't Shoot narrative. I bought the active Twitter activist Sean King, too. And, of course, Sean King's been in the news lately about that. And he goes through how he really believed that, again, Michael Brown said, hands up, don't shoot. My commentary yesterday, if you didn't have a chance to look at it, it's still available on the website. And I simply point you to a couple of places where, if you aren't familiar, we have Larry Elder, for example, who's been on the program with us, but he has done a 5-minute PragerU video on what he calls the Ferguson lie. And then also Michael Brown, who, interesting enough, shares the same name with Michael Brown, who was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, wrote a piece called The Ferguson Lie That Won't Die, That Will Not Die. The reason I bring that up is he had a couple of years ago a friend suggest that he actually use Google Alerts, which I've used as well. But my name is pretty unusual. You know, not many Kerby Andersons out there, but there are a lot of Michael Browns. And he said every single day he would see about 4 articles or more about Michael Brown, and almost every one of them talks about this idea, hands up, don't shoot. Well, nevertheless, Jason Whitlock, who starts out with a confession that I really bought the hands up, don't shoot narrative, but I kind of changed my mind, if for no other reason than the Justice Department, under the guidance of President Barack Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder, both African-American, like Jason Whitlock is, unearthed the facts regarding Michael Brown's shooting. Brown didn't have his hands up. Brown reached inside Officer Darren Wilson's patrol car and tussled with Wilson for control of his gun. Wilson shot Brown while Brown was running towards the officer. Again, so the Department of Justice exonerated Darren Wilson, although I don't think he feels like that. I sort of lost track of even where he is and probably fear for how he's going to have to live the rest of his life because of that incident. So anyway, Jason Whitlock asked this question. So why did the San Antonio Spurs coach, Greg Popovich, spend time promoting a Michael Brown narrative debunked by a black president, a black attorney general, and colorblind facts? If you hadn't seen it, this is a part of what Greg Popovich said. There was this young man who just graduated from high school about a week earlier, I think. There was some sort of altercation that everybody has not agreed upon yet, but that fact is agreed upon that this is a young man with his hands in the air, running from the officer, running away, received 6 shots in the back that killed him. Goes on then talk about what a horrible culture we have and how dangerous it is for black men and all the rest. But anyway, back to Jason Whitlock. He said, first of all, Brown was not shot in the back. According to the forensic evidence, all bullets entered Brown from the front as he charged towards Wilson. And he says, you know, Greg Popovich is a basketball coach. He's clearly willfully ignorant about the Brown case, and probably fair to presume he's willfully ignorant about many of the other issues involved alleged racial injustice. And then a few days later, apparently Greg Popovich went into another rant, this time talking about the literacy tests in North Carolina. But okay, you know, again, you're allowed to express any opinion you might want to be. But the point that Jason Whitlock is saying is this is a coach who preaches to his players to let go of the past and focus on opportunities in front of them. A great player mentally lets go of a bad play so that he can take advantage of the next opportunity to contribute. You know, I can't say I was a great basketball player, but I'll tell you, I learned that lesson pretty quickly because I noticed that if somebody blew it and the coach yelled at him and his head was down as he was going back to play defense, the coach would pull him out immediately. Because I could see the coach was going to say, look, if you're going to still be concerned about the mistake you made a minute ago, you're going to make another one. I'm going to pull you out right now. And so here, the question that Jason Whitlock is asking is a good one. Why are Greg Popovich and other angry white right liberals, and I could mention some others that are coaches in other teams as well, constantly pushing black people to hold on to the wrongs of the past. Is any other group repeatedly asked to do this by outside forces? And then he goes into some other issues about that as well. But the point he makes is, Greg Popovich is not dumb. He's intentionally promoting racial animus. He says we oftentimes, and this is again Jason Whitlock, ascribe good intentions to liberals. We've been programmed to believe their mistakes are the result of unintended consequences. He says, I used to think that way, now I don't. A reporter inside the Orlando bubble should ask Greg Popovich why he lied about Michael Brown's encounter with Darren Wilson, because he said, I don't believe it was an accident. He's one of the smartest coaches in basketball. He's just not that stupid. But again, it's a good illustration of the fact that even as we try on this program to say, here are the facts simply get blurred as soon as you even watch a sporting event. And so this, I thought, was very helpful that Jason Whitlock, who is primarily covering sports, just had to step out for a minute and say, look, I used to buy the hands up, don't shoot narrative until I looked at the facts, and I'm just appalled as an African American that we now have a coach for the San Antonio Spurs just whipping up this sentiment when it's wrong, and we know it's wrong. So anyway, it's something I thought I might just pass on to you as a reminder again. When you read something like that or you hear something like that, check it out. See whether or not hands up, don't shoot is actually something that has been verified by the Obama administration or something that was actually dismissed by it. One last comment real quickly. If you've noticed that the post office seems to be slowing down, it is. One of the biggest criticisms coming against the Trump administration now is coming against the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, who was, I think, put in that position in large part because he was a mega donor to Donald Trump. There is a mistake right there. And it does seem to me that there is a postal service that's supposed to deliver life-saving medicines, election ballots. Oh, that gets us back to mail-in ballots, doesn't it? Checks, bills, and everything else. And yet it turns out that a number of overtime action workers actually have been set aside. And so according to the American Postal Workers Union, which represents about 200,000 postal workers, that's about 20% of all work by mail handlers is usually done in overtime. And since they're no longer providing overtime because the Postal Service is sort of broke, then you're going to see the mail get slower and slower and slower. Now, you might say, what does the president want to do? Well, Donald Trump has repeatedly refused to sign any legislation that would give a bailout to the Postal Service because his argument was the Postal Service is a joke. Now, I think the president is wrong on that, but it's just one more little piece I thought I'd put on the table here to illustrate while we keep talking about this idea of mail-in ballots, in addition to the issue of fraud and just government difficulties in the Election Bureau, also the growing evidence that the Postal Service really is slowing down. We'll have more to say about that probably in a week or two, but the research coming in is illustrating that we've got a problem in the Postal Service, and we'll have to talk about that. But we need to take a break, and we'll come back with Sean Dunn right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful you could be with us over the next 2 hours. Going to spend some time this hour talking about the younger generation, which is something we do so often here at Point of View, the millennial generation, Generation Y, XY, as well as, of course, Generation Z, the so-called iGen generation. I might also mention that we'll do another one of our Millennial Roundtable next Tuesday, so that will be something to look forward to. So we're going to talk about this very dynamic outreach to young people. Then next hour, we'll spend some time talking with Spencer Klavan about his podcast, Young Heretics, which kind of fits into this very well. And then we'll get back into issues in the news. You will notice that I've posted a couple of articles. One by Dennis Prager, was in studio with us recently, America's in Real Danger, and I'll go into that in more detail and explain what he means there. And then a lot of people have said, well, what about Senator Kamala Harris? Is she really a moderate? Very good piece that appeared in the Federalist that I think gives you a better look at that, and even some of the facts and figures that you might want to know about that. And then a piece by Ben Shapiro on the pick that was made by Joe Biden. And then if you have time, we have some other great material that we will try to cover. All of that taking place in the next 2 hours. So I hope you can join us for all of that. But I thought, first of all, we might spend some time, as we do so often, talking about how can we reach the next generation. This would be the millennial generation and Generation Z, and we have talked about that with so many different guests. And so we brought into the studio here Sean Dunn, who is the founder and president of Groundwire, and he's been in full-time Christian ministry for 3 decades, so he's an older guy just like I am, served in local church ministry and all of the rest. But in the midst of this, developed the idea of reaching out to the next generation by using their cell phones. And I've heard people say that, was it about 84% of millennials are never more than 10 feet away from their cell phones. So, Sean, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, great to be here, Kerby.
I have watched you on video. It's great to see you in studio. And as a matter of fact, people can learn a little bit more, not only about you by going and typing your name out there on YouTube, but we also have a couple of links. First of all, we have Groundwire, which if you click on your picture, will take you to groundwire.net, which gives you kind of an overview of what's happening. And then the other one, which takes you to what's called JesusCares.com. And I really do encourage all of you to take the time to watch a couple of those videos, maybe see if you can post one or two and start the conversation. But give us the idea behind this. I think I've already sort of illustrated that these young people, they always have a cell phone and they know where it is and they're always looking at it. So what a great way to share the gospel.
Yeah, well, the idea came when we started to ask the question, how do you reach a generation that's running away from the church?
Yes.
How do you reach a generation that plugs their ears every time you disagree with them? It's very difficult to invite them into a setting where you can share the gospel with them because they have so many excuses or reasons why they're too busy or whatever. Basically, it's difficult to get in front of them. So God gave us a strategy not to invite them, but to interrupt them. Mm-hmm. We know that the most powerful marketing principle in the world is found in Scripture. Faith comes by hearing.
Yes.
And we quote that in a spiritual sense, but it's true in every form of marketing. The more we hear something, the more we believe it. How did we get where we are as a nation? It's because they started to say it decades ago, and we started to embrace it little by little. So what we do is we interrupt them on their social media devices and on different platforms digitally and just suggest, hey, we know what you're going through. Why don't you come talk to us about it? Jesus is the answer. So one of our tags on the Jesus Cares platform oftentimes is when life hurts, Jesus cares. They are not looking for deep and meaningful theological answers. They're in survival mode. They're not waking up saying, oh no, I'm going to hell. They're waking up saying, oh no, I'm going through hell. And when you engage with them on that area and invite them in, they are very, very open to learning about how Jesus can heal their pain, how he can meet their need, how he can forgive their sins. He meets their physical needs and their eternal needs. And God is just doing some amazing things. We're blown away by what he's doing right now.
You know, you talk about running away, whether we've had Shine Pruitt on here, Jonathan Teague, of course, the person that sits in this chair oftentimes is Chelsea Human. They point out the fact that the younger generation isn't necessarily wanting to run away from Jesus. They just want to run away from the institutional church.
Right.
And so this idea that some people in church growth right now have, if you build it, they will come, which borrows a phrase from another movie, is not true, because they simply won't. This is a generation that has not gone to church. The example I use so often is a friend of mine that used to teach at the Art Institute here. When she would teach architecture, she'd take them into different buildings, and when they would walk into a church, most of the kids would say, this is the first time I've ever been in a church. So if you think building a church and they're going to come in the back door of the church or the front door of the church, not going to happen, right?
Yeah, according to Thomas Rainer, in a book called Millennials, America's Largest Generation, he said that 70%, based on his research, 70% of American millennials believe the American church is irrelevant.
Right.
It doesn't even say that they hate it. It says they don't see a purpose in it. And so if we are expecting them to run into the church, they don't get that. One of the statistics that really encourages me and inspires me and drives me is 72% of millennials believe that God is a real being and not just a concept. They believe, they're not atheistic. The media's tried to convince us that they hate God. They don't. They believe that God's a real being and not just concepts, but they set him aside. They say, I'm going to figure out my life, and then I'll think about eternity. I'll think about God. So they go on to their pile of pain, their purpose. Who am I? What am I here for? And one of these days I'm going to go back. Well, the problem is there's two problems with that. Number one is you're never going to figure out your life.
Right.
I mean, and secondarily, you were never made to figure out your life without the one who created you. So because of that, one of the things that I say often is we don't need to convince this generation that he's real. We need to remind them that he's relevant. And when they realize that he is relevant, that he cares about their pain, that he can heal their heart, that he is the one who created them for purpose, he can bring out the best in them because he knows what he put inside of them, then their eyes begin to open. They start to turn back to Jesus. But again, they're not saying, ooh, I think I want to go to church. They're saying, man, Jesus is pretty attractive.
You know, last time we had Tom and Jess Rayner on, we talked about the fact that it isn't so much that they hate the church or they hate God. It just isn't even something they're thinking about. So in some respects, your various short video clips are to just all of a sudden create a sense of interest for something they at that moment had no interest in, right?
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. The doorway that we engage with people is through their crisis. It's not through theology.
Yes.
We have to get to theology if we want to introduce them to Jesus, but truthfully, it really is, you're lonely, aren't you? You're miserable. Your mask is hiding it, but if we crawl behind your mask, something's going on in your heart. Let's talk about that. And it's the crisis is their doorway through which we can have the conversation about Christ.
Yes.
It's the way it's the place that you start.
We're going to talk a little bit about how you can use some of this, how you can support this great organization. And if you'd like to join the conversation today, of course, as we talk about the two generations, the millennials and Generation Z that are aimless and distracted and confused, those are some topics that we certainly want to put on the table. Feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about Jesus Cares and Groundwire, we have all that information on our website, pointofview.net, or you can go there directly. And I want to give you an assignment. Watch a few of those videos. First of all, you see a lot of young people crying, which is pretty amazing to me. And they have very good production values. And see if you can then use that in a way to even expand your ministry. But most importantly, I want to talk more about this ministry and encourage your phone calls if you'd like to join us. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The
Let me start with an important question. Should teachers be considered essential workers? Over the last few months, we have designated police officers and firefighters, along with doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals as essential workers. We've even designated grocery workers, delivery drivers, food processors, and truck drivers as essential. These people, and many others we could list, went to their jobs every day. Some complained, but most considered the potential risks and did what they could to prevent catching the coronavirus. We owe these people a tremendous debt of gratitude. By contrast, lots of public school teachers and the teachers' unions are resisting any attempt to reopen the schools. There have been petitions and even protests. That's why most schools will be closed this fall. We closed down school systems months ago because we assumed that children would be the most vulnerable group during a pandemic. We now know that children are the least vulnerable to the virus. The American Academy of Pediatricians advocated that schools have a goal of having students physically present in schools. The New England Journal of Medicine warns that children living in poverty, children of color, English language learners, children with diagnosed disabilities, and young children face especially severe losses. Will some teachers be more at risk than others if schools reopen? That's possible, but one survey found that only 17% of public school teachers are in the vulnerable age range of 55 or older. This could be managed. Public schools in other countries in Europe and in Australia have been able to do this successfully. For years, we've been told that educating the next generation is essential. So why shouldn't governors, mayors, and school administrators designate teachers as essential workers? It is a question that I suggest you ask them, especially during this election season. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, if you've ever gone out and talked to young people, maybe you've met them and had some conversation at a Starbucks, or maybe you do some church visitation. I mean, you'll hear things like, well, can you give me any hope? Or can you help me with my problems? Or tell me life's going to get better, you old guy, you know, because it doesn't look very good for me right now. And given the fact that we have a generation that has done very well financially up until recently with the crisis, nevertheless, the suicide rate has just increased dramatically. So one of the reasons we wanted you to know about this very dynamic ministry was so that you could put people in touch with it, and also that you could pray for it and support it. So again, we have Sean Dunn in the studio with us, founder and president of Groundwire and Jesus Cares. But let's talk about some of the issues, because as you said, almost 3 out of every 4 of these young people, whether it's millennials or Generation Z, say that they believe God exists. Mm-hmm. They also believe in heaven, but they don't go to church.
Right.
So on the one hand, they're kind of like what we talked about yesterday with George Barna. They have some theological identity, but they don't have any connection to anything that we would consider to be biblical. Is that fair?
Right. You know, it's the fastest growing, I'm sure you've talked about this with your other guests based on the names that I'm hearing here, the fastest growing spiritual segment in our nation, they call them the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. Truthfully, that freaks out church members. Like the church is freaking out saying, we're losing ground, well, alert, we've been losing ground. That actually doesn't discourage me. It actually encourages me. Here's why. So they say, I think it's 36 to 38%, I forget the exact statistic, claim none, meaning I have no religious affiliation. I don't choose a side. None is just a woke word for agnostic.
Yes.
The difference is when my generation said agnostic, there was this underlying perception that I want to know truth. I want to figure this out. With the younger generations, the understanding is, hey, I'm really not pursuing truth. I'm not seeking. There's a lot of great seeker ministries out there. One of the reasons we do what we do is because the younger generations aren't asking the right questions. So you have to help them ask the right questions. So let me summarize this. The reason I'm encouraged by nuns is because they have not rejected Christianity. Most of them have never been exposed to true Christianity. They've been exposed to the idea of religion, but never to Jesus. And when somebody introduces them to Jesus, the eyes get big, the light goes on, and they're like, man, I want to figure this out.
And maybe one way to illustrate that, we've mentioned Tom and Jess Rayner, so we'll mention them one more time. I remember in their survey, one of the things they found is they asked the question, can you know what happens after death? And the most typical answer was, nobody can know what happens after death. Well, that is a perfect evangelistic opportunity to say, well, would you like to know for certain that you would have eternal life? I mean, after all, that says that in 1 John. And it's a good opening because, as you said, it isn't that I am hostile. I just don't think about it. When I have a survey, atheist, agnostic, no preference. Yep, I'll check that box. And that's the nuns. But it isn't like I've got my Duke suck, although some of them do, and they call in every once in a while because they've been reading the latest new atheist and want to give us arguments against the existence of God. But most of the time, they just haven't thought about it because it's just not relevant to their lives, is it?
No. They USA Today did an article 2, 3, 4 years ago, and it said that there's atheists in our nation, no God. There's monotheists like Christians, one God. But they said most of the people in our nation are apatheists.
Yes.
And I thought, what a great way to summarize it. I'm apathetic. I just don't think about it. I don't think it affects my life. That's our audience. We're not going after the strict atheist. We're going after the person who's just wandering, surviving, because when you shine light into their darkness and you bring hope into their hopelessness, they're more than willing to have that conversation with you.
You know, Jesus talks about the sheep without a shepherd. Isn't that really what we're talking about here?
Oh, yeah. You know, and that's the thing about this, our culture. The reason I believe that we're in a moment right now where people are more open to the claims of Christ than ever before, and it's because of that scripture. In Matthew 9:35-38, Jesus is walking. He says they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. They're confused. Culture's a mess. There is no leader. They don't know who to trust. And when I look at our nation, that's our nation.
That is our nation now. It was before, but now the veneer is off, the mask is off, to use your illustration before, and you have riots, and you have protests, and you have a pandemic, and you have all sorts of foundations that seem secure. We honestly thought that we as a nation could address this because we have the moral foundations and we have the institutional structure, and all of that has been ripped off. And so in some respects, this has been the best year for you at all, hasn't it? So talk about that.
Well, let's look at that scripture, though. It says, harass and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus identified culture as a mess, the very next thing he said is, the harvest is ripe.
Yes.
When people don't know who to trust, they're open to finding hope. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing the great results. I mean, our numbers are so good that I had a guy look at me and say, I don't believe you.
Yes.
Your numbers are too good. I know how difficult it is. Churches are struggling. Denominations are struggling. He said, don't come back and talk to me until you get your numbers validated. So we went out and hired the number one company in the nation to validate. But yeah, we just topped 84,000.
Which is more than you had all of last year.
Right.
Right?
On Monday, we topped 84,000 commitments to Christ in the U.S. On Monday, year to date. Millennials are just, they're looking, they're searching, they're hungry. You know, and this shelter at home thing actually is to our advantage.
Yes.
Because when you shelter at home, you take two things with you. You take your device and your misery.
Yeah.
And it played right into the sight lines of our scope.
Yeah, and the screen times are just off the charts. It was just going up all the time.
Right.
And when you were talking about the guy that was skeptical, let's take another one. You were telling me off air, but might as well talk about it on air. Somebody was skeptical about praying for this nation, that because of this has changed his mind, right?
Yeah, a guy came up to me about 2 months ago. I was speaking somewhere out in California. He came up to me and he said, hey, I'm going to start praying for our nation again. He said, I've stopped. Because I wasn't seeing fruit here. I wasn't seeing kingdom stuff here. I wasn't seeing harvest here. He said, now hearing what I'm hearing, here's the thing. Barna said in 2017 that the average church in the U.S. sees one person a year come to Christ.
Yes.
we are seeing 360, 370 a day right now come to faith. Which, man, that's exciting. That's an altar call. I close my eyes and I picture the altar call where people are standing up and they're walking away from sin and towards Jesus. And that's what gets me going as an evangelist. But we're seeing 360 a day come to faith. So it's pretty exciting.
Let's talk about the actual impressions, because we've talked about the number that have become Christians, 84,000. So I've already got that number down. But when we look at the number of these that are viewed, again, one of the things that you talk about here is our mission to 1 million. Well, you're reaching a lot more than 1 million. Talk about that.
Well, so in February, one of my guys said, how many people have made professions of faith, have given their lives to Christ since we started? And I said, well, we've been around for a long time, but we didn't really start measuring until 2016.
Right.
So I took out the calculator and I added up, and I realized that in the last 4 years, we have seen 162,861, I believe is the number, come to faith.
Right.
In the last 4 years, and we've grown 85% year over year. And so I added it up and realized if we just continue seeing what we're seeing, what God's doing supernaturally, we'll top 1 million people in the U.S. coming to faith by 2022. So that's the mission to 1 million that we're going after, is seeing 1 million people actually walk that virtual altar to or aisle to come down and place their trust in Jesus' hands.
So let's see if we can open up the phones, because maybe some of you have thoughts about how to reach out to a millennial generation, or you were unaware of the fact that this would be a very effective way to do so. So I'd love to give you a chance. 1-800-351-1212. And Sean, just before we take a break, and we'll talk more about that after the break, when people go to the website, that's where they can get involved, right? So talk about what is available on the website.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is one of the things that makes us unique is 24 hours a day we have live coaches available. And so that's what makes it unique is millennials and Gen Z, they don't just want the monologue that they've been perceiving coming from the church. What they want is a dialogue. They want to come online and say, so young girl came online and she just asked this question of one of our coaches. She said, do I matter? And when I read it, I thought, how many people in the world ask that? Does anybody see me? Do I matter? Do you care? The coach did a great job, engaged her, said, you absolutely matter. You matter to me. I'm sure there's people in your life you matter to, but most importantly, you matter to God. Crown of his creation, apple of his eye, just laid it out. She ended up giving her life to Christ. And at the end of the chat, the coach said, so you came online and you asked, do I matter? Let me turn it around. Do you matter? Now that you know what God said, do you matter? And she came on with a question mark, and she left with all caps, I do matter. 3 exclamation points.
We're going to tell some more stories, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. So Sean Dunn in studio. And if you find yourself saying this would be something I'd like to pass on to people in my church or friends and neighbors, again, we are encouraging you to watch it, but also later on you can go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll see a section there that has both watch or listen. You can download the listen part and send that particular podcast to someone else, but also you can watch it, and especially since he's in studio today, you can watch it or later see it on YouTube. Let's take a break, though. We'll take some phone calls, too, 1-800-351-1212. What about this outreach to millennials and Gen Z? We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Sean Dunn in studio with us, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you're just joining us, I might just mention he is the founder and president of Groundwire, and again, just a very, very dynamic outreach that is taking place. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, you can listen to this again as a podcast, but most importantly, I would encourage you maybe to click on groundwire.net, which will give you information about the organization, but then we also have one, JesusCares.com. I really encourage you to watch some of the video. But before we do all of that, let's, if we can, take some phone calls. So let's go first to New Hampshire. Anthony, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, guys.
What's on your mind?
So I just wanted to say I'm really inspired because I came to Christ this year throughout everything, and I'm also an aspiring evangelist. Obviously, I have a long way to go in doing that, but I just would like some beginner points for that because I have so much love for Christ in my heart. I share Bible verses on Instagram, and I share what comes my way, but I wanted to know if there's anything, any advice.
Anthony, I was just thinking we might actually give Sean Dunn's email. Is that okay in just a minute?
Great.
For him or anybody else that would like to get some of the report that I have here, and because that might be a tool that you could put in the hands of anybody that really wants to use social media in evangelism. Talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the goal is to interrupt their thought process and interject Christ as the answer and then be there to follow up with them. Anthony, there's three primary questions that we encourage our coaches to use as they're trying to get their people involved in gospel conversations. And so I'd encourage you to look for ways to interject these. And one of them is, what do you think God sees when he looks at you? Because most people have a really distorted perception of that. And when they say, I think he doesn't look at me, he ignores me, or I think he's mad at me, you can interject, no, he adores you. He thinks you're amazing. As a matter of fact, he loves you so much, he created a way so that you could be close to him. Can I tell you what that is? The second one is, and Kerby already mentioned this, but where do you go to find hope? In this world, where do you go to find hope? Most people don't have a solution for that. They're trying to escape. They're trying to ignore. They're trying to survive. And so if they say, I don't have any place to find hope, you can say, can I tell you where I found hope? And it's through a personal relationship with Jesus, transformed me from the inside out. And then the third one, and I love this one, is I love to say to people, you want to be close to God, don't you? But you don't know how. Because so many people long to be close to God, and then you can say, you know what? It's almost like there's like this divide that's keeping you from getting to him. And then that gives you opportunity right there to say, you know what? God wants to be close to you too. You want to be close to him. You can see him from a distance. You get this glimpse of him. But the reason you really can't get close to him is because of this separation. Well, that's been covered, and you can walk into the gospel message through that. Those are three great ways that whenever I can engage with somebody in one of those three questions and they're willing to answer and to, if they're willing to have an open dialogue, those are the three questions that I always try and get to.
Anthony, those are great questions. I hope you'll think those through. And if you didn't have a chance to write them down real quickly, again, the podcast is available so you can go back and check them again. So I just really want to encourage you because one of the things we find is that when somebody becomes a Christian, they oftentimes have a lot of non-Christian friends. Mm-hmm. If you're an old fossil like me, after a while, you've either converted them all or driven them away. And there aren't as many evangelistic opportunities face-to-face, but, of course, there are all sorts of opportunities on social media. So, Anthony, thank you for calling in today.
Thank you for the help. I had my notes, and I'm taking notes. Thank you.
Well, again, for the rest of you, let's, if we can, and including Anthony, if you said off air you're willing to give up your email, and you have this report, which I'm reading from. Now, again, they can find some of this on the website, but you'd be glad to send this to them. So talk about that.
Right. So I would, two things I'd love to send anybody who's interested in this is I'd love to send our impact report, the audited impact report that shows exactly what God's been doing as a comparison over the last several years. And then I'd also love to send you a testimony video of one of the young people that's given her life to Christ and the coach that led her to Christ. So they interview both of them. It's a powerful tool because it really helps frame how we do what we do and how we interrupt and what the coaches do. And so if you just want to shoot me an email at first name S Dunn, DUNN, at groundwire.net. I'd love to send those two things to you just so you can see what's going on, understand a little bit better, maybe begin to pray for the ministry, and maybe even consider becoming one of our online volunteers that's impacting people literally every day by the hundreds.
Again, sdunn at groundwire.net. Also gave that to my producer in case somebody calls in and needs that, and that would be a great resource. And while we're talking about some of these stories, these are incredible because, again, you probably could fill up the rest of the hour with stories, but I'd like to at least to have you share one or two of those right now before we get into how people can help you. Yeah,
well, one of my favorites is a young lady logged in, and her name was Naomi, and she was 19 years old, and all she said, she didn't really, sometimes they're hesitant. Mm-hmm. She didn't kind of air her dirty laundry. All she said was, I saw this commercial. It said, when life hurts, Jesus cares. My life hurts. And she's instantly connected to Bev. Bev is a wonderful, wonderful coach, just a brilliant. She graduated from Bible college, but never got into ministry, vocational ministry. Mm-hmm. And but she just wanted to engage with people online. And so she keeps trying to dig to figure out why her life's so hard. Well, Naomi wouldn't really share much. But Bev said to her, well, could I share with you what it was like for me growing up?
Perfect, yeah.
And so she began to share about how she struggled with depression. She was suicidal and how Jesus transformed her life, sharing the gospel. And she says, if you choose to place your trust in Jesus, forgiveness of sins, heaven is your home, all of the benefits. But then she said this, she said, not only that, but he'll never leave you. And Naomi interrupted and said, wait a second. Everybody leaves me. Mm-hmm. Everybody leaves me.
Sad.
Dad left me, stepdad. And what was interesting is the selling portion of the gospel for her was that God would walk with her all day, every day.
Isn't that something?
And so she said, I want to give my life to Christ. So they prayed. Bev said, Naomi, what a joy to talk to you today. And Naomi said, you don't know what this has meant to me. Mm-hmm. She said, this was my last day. Notes written, sitting next to 168 pills that I've gathered over the last several months. I'm ready to take my life, and I just kind of internally cringed. She didn't pray because she didn't know who to pray to. She just cringed and said, I need to find hope, otherwise I'm done. And Bev said, oh, honey, you now have hope. You have a future. And while they were on the chat, she went and flushed the pills down the toilet. They talked about the fact that she cut herself. And then,
yes, I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
So on... that was on Saturday. On Monday, I'm flying into Orange County, and I realized Bev is one of our volunteers who connected with us through a radio interview, and I never met her. And I realized I had an appointment cancel the next day. So on Tuesday, I drive out to her house. She was waiting for me, and I said, I just want to come meet you. And she gave me this hug, and she says, you don't know what Groundwire's meant to me. She said, I'm a shut-in. My husband has Parkinson's. My mom has dementia. She said, but when I put him to bed, she said, I get on the computer and I get to tell people about my Jesus. So we're having this conversation. It was beautiful. I said, before I leave, two things, Bev. I said, let's talk about, I said, I want to take a picture with you. Secondly, show me where you do your chats. And because it's not on the phone, it's all text instant message because that's how this generation operates. She took me into her office, and there was her computer, and right next to it was a long wicker basket. And in it there were 5x7 cards of every chat she'd had in the last 18 months.
Wow.
Names, follow-up information, prayer requests, and we plugged them into a church, all of these things. And as I'm sitting there kind of flipping through them, she hands me Naomi's. Mm-hmm. And I start reading Naomi's, and I realize there's something different. And I said, Bev, why is this one rubber banded to a stack? And she kind of looked at the floor almost awkwardly, almost very humbly, and said, those are the ones the Lord's allowed me to introduce to him so far. And I said, Bev, how many at the time? This was a couple of years ago. She said, 88 so far.
88.
So, and the great thing is she emailed me a month later and she said, hey, Naomi just got baptized in that church we connected her to. Emailed me 3 months later, hey, Naomi just went on her first missions trip. And so they've stayed in touch through this whole thing. But God is using Bev. And the thing is when we started this, I thought about Naomi because I'm a youth guy.
Yes.
I never thought about Bev. I thought about the ones who needed the conversation. I forgot that there's Christians out there that are dying for an opportunity to share their faith and the spiritual growth that takes place when they get to share their story, their testimony, when they get to invest in other people's lives, they grow. we have this growing army all over the world of Bevs that are taking the time to tell people about Jesus, and it's transforming their lives, and it's changing so many young people's lives as well.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of you might want to be one of those next Bevs, and we're going to talk about that. And most importantly, this is an opportunity for you to support this ministry in prayer and with your financial support. And so we have all sorts of links that you can find very easily. Again, click on the picture there by Sean Dunn, and the first one takes you to groundwire.net, so you can certainly find that as well. And then the next one, I certainly want you to go and look at some of those videos at jesuscares.com. And it has information about the mission and the history and the impact and all the rest. But then most importantly, I want you to see some of those videos, because I think you'll see what is happening. And also, we just mentioned again, sdunn@groundwire.net. Now, we may just fill up your inbox, but I guess that's okay.
Good problem.
Okay. Let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with Sean Dunn, who's in studio with us right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, 1-800-351-1212. In studio with us today, the founder and president of Groundwire, which is Sean Dunn. But some of our listeners might say, I want to get in. I want to learn how to be a counselor, and I would be just thrilled to be able to reach out to a future Naomi. So how does an individual go about doing that?
Yeah, we were joking about Bea Bev.
Bev?
Bev is one of our superstars. She is so amazing and so inspiring. But yeah, Bev, or if you're interested in the process, the way I described it is like street witnessing. The difference is they tap you on the shoulder. I mean, how much more bold would we be if we knew that they wanted to talk to us about Jesus?
Yes.
If you'd love to have that, I mean, one of the things is that we have to continue to grow is our coaching team. We've added 265 in the last 4 months, and it's not enough.
Not enough.
The traffic's up. So if you go to one of our websites, I'd encourage you, go to JesusCares.com, a little bit easier to navigate. Go to the top, get involved, pull down, and there's a link there that says Become a Coach. And there's just an opportunity there for you to watch some videos, to see some interviews with some of our coaches, to look at frequently asked questions, and then even to fill out the application if you want to get involved. We do have to train and vet, and some people are offended by that. But the reason we do is because people keep trying to sneak in and infiltrate us from the back end. So we take this very seriously. There's a stewardship issue with it.
So again, JesusCares.com. Go to the drop-down menu. It says Get Involved. First one is Become a Coach. Let's talk about some others. Prayer team, Add My Church, Donate. There are some great opportunities. And when we get to donation, I want you to talk about cost per commitment, because that is an incredible number, which is so off the charts good compared to what we spend when we try to reach out. But first of all, I would encourage all of our listeners to pray for you. So can they join the prayer team?
Absolutely.
Or does that involve?
Yes, please. We send out prayer focus updates weekly, just 3 or 4 points about what's going on, different markets, different opportunities, as we try and continue to change the way a generation views God.
Yes. And then donation. I mean, again, I recognize that during this downtime, this is a time in which individuals recognize that maybe the most successful evangelistic outreaches are going to be taking place online. And when you developed this years ago, you didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, which caused everybody to be locked in place. But this continues on without any interruption at all, doesn't it?
People have said this to me. Some really well-known evangelists have said, we know that the digital space is the next frontier in evangelism. And God has just led us, not because we're smarter than anybody else. We're really not. If you're watching the video, you're looking at me thinking, that guy doesn't look like he knows what he's doing. That's okay. But, I mean, just to kind of give you some scope, and this is weird because we really don't talk about this in domestic circles and in the church, but it costs us, for the first 6 months of the year, $18.94 to see somebody come to faith.
Right.
Now, somebody would say, well, that's sacrilegious. You can't put a cost on a soul. That's not what we're saying. We know that if you're saying the right thing to the right people on the right platforms at the right time, you're going to see costs go down. Well, so here's the question. Is that a good number?
That's just off the charts number, is what it is. Yeah, go ahead.
Churches and denominations have told me it costs them over $30,000 to see one person come to faith. And just the fact that they're carrying around this device, begging us to communicate to them through it, and they're very open to responding. And so for every $18.94 that came in, that's every salary, software, every marketing cost, everything we do, somebody came to faith. It's pretty exciting, and we're seeing even more. That number's going in the right direction.
Again, this is part of that mission to 1 million that you believe will happen by the end of 2022, probably earlier when I'm starting to look at these numbers. And again, this is part of this impact report, and you gave out your email. We'll do it again in just a minute, but it looks at the number of videos that were watched, the number of web visits, and then you've already said, but let's talk about that for a minute, the number that stay connected. We just talked about this with Bev and Naomi, but there is an attempt to actually follow those individuals up. And of course, when they contact you, you already have their cell phone number, you have their text, you have their email, you have a way to really keep connected with them, which is always one of the big question marks when you have an open air evangelism or even an evangelistic revival in a church, because in some respects, you can keep connected to them in ways that most of the rest of us cannot.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have 100% result, but the fact is 23% in the first 6 months of the year. We approach the people who make professions of faith, not before, because we found out if you approach them for contact information before you have a connection with them, they run away. But after they say, I need Jesus, I know I need Jesus, 23%, we say, we're not going to give it away, we're not going to sell it. All we're going to do is we're going to send you content to help you better understand how to grow in this new thing that you're doing with Jesus. 23% of them said, Here's my cell phone number, which is the most intimate piece of contact information they have. And 23% of them are saying, yeah, please help me grow in this. We'd love for it to be 100, but that's a great number. So we're approaching 20,000 for the year so far that have given us that their cell phone, and so we're continuing to move them towards Christ and towards community through that process.
So we talked about becoming a coach. We've talked about the prayer, talked about donation. But, Sean, one of the things I've noticed is we have a number of pastors. We have a number of people that are Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders, all the rest. You have a section there about Add My Church. How can a church come alongside with you?
You know, that is one of our greatest needs, because these new believers need to plug in. And what we're finding is that the church is intimidating to them because many of them have never been. And so they're not really willing to walk in. So we're trying to reverse the model. We have partner churches that when we call them, we're not saying, hey, I want your pulpit. We're not saying, I want your people. We're not saying, I want your money. We're saying, we have new believers in your neighborhood that gave us permission because we said we have friends in a local church that will encourage them. Would you reach out to these people? And that's what's getting them through the door.
Yes.
It's not the label. It's not the worship. It's not the pastoral sermon. It's really, is somebody going to engage with me when I walk through the door? That's what's getting them through the door. And so we need your church to partner with us in that way.
Yes. Well, if you have ever been in a foreign country, or let's just even keep it in the United States, even just been in a town, and you decide, I think I'm going to go to church, you know how much anxiety you have, and you've been at a church. And so you can imagine what it's like a person's never been in there, to know that when I come in the front door, there's somebody's going to shake my hand, or at least give me a fist bump, I guess, these days, and actually get me involved.
No, and one of the things that we need to understand about the younger generation, we talked about the nuns earlier, but this generation, they teeter between post and pre-Christian. Post-Christian says, I don't go, but I know what they think. I know what they do. I know what they stand for. Pre-Christian says, Mom didn't go, Grandma didn't go. I don't know what they think. We're finding the younger generations, they're more pre-Christian than post in certain circles. We get asked the questions like, do I have to call ahead and make a reservation to go to church?
Yes.
We get asked the question, how much are they going to charge me if I try and go to church? We get asked the question, Jesus is interesting. Is there a book I could read about him? If we make the assumption that the younger generations understand what we understood growing up, we're going to totally miss the mark, because they are unchurched. They have no biblical knowledge. When I've had people argue with me, that's not the story of Jonah. That's the story of Pinocchio. No, it's in the Bible.
It's in the Bible.
And so anyway, but yeah, what gets them through the doors when somebody's sitting there saying, "Man, I'm so glad you're here, and I'm excited to walk with you."
Well, again, just been great to have Sean Dunn in studio. Let's do it again. But first of all, we have a link to Groundwire, but also we suggest maybe you go to JesusCares.com, hit that button that says Get Involved, and there's also a chat opportunity. And most importantly, I just hope you watch some of those videos and see the production values and the impact that it's having. And one last time, if you want that impact report, you were nice enough to give your email. Yep. Okay, we'll wear you out. sdunn@groundwire.net. And it's just been great to have you in studio.
Thank you so
I'm looking
much.
forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, we will have the next guest by phone. Spencer Klavan will be with us for just a little bit of time. The Young Heretics Podcast. I think this Heretics Podcast has kind of a PragerU video kind of feel for it, so we'll talk about that. Then we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about a podcast that you need to know about. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. We may have a little more of an insight as to why COVID-19 strikes some people stronger than others. That comes from some material in Science magazine. Got a piece by Dennis Prager, Why America's in Real Danger, especially when you begin to understand what happened in Europe after World War I, and can some of that happen here as well in terms of various kinds of totalitarianism showing up in this country. And then we'll also spend a little bit of time talking about Senator Kamala Harris, in particular arguing that she's not the moderate everybody has been portraying her to be. So those are some things we'll get to later this hour. But I wanted you to know about this new podcast, which is entitled Young Heretics. Now, it is done by Spencer Klavan. And you know that we oftentimes quote from his father, Andrew Klavan, and so we're just thrilled that he can be here. You might also remember that he was the one that produced that op-ed piece, which, if I remember right, said something like, you know, the only thing standing in the way of woke culture, woke mob, is the Republican Party. So he takes on a lot of these very important issues, and not only in addition to hosting this podcast, also as the assistant editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. He has a book coming out on music in ancient Greece that'll come out next year. He has been writing, as I mentioned, in Newsweek and Atlantic and a variety of other places, has his degree in classics from Yale University and a doctorate in Greek and Latin languages and literature from Oxford University. And Spencer, just great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Kerby. It's great to be here.
Matter of fact, when I think one of the publicists said, are you familiar with him? I said, yes, I am. And if he wants to come on, I'm glad to do so, because, in matter of fact, one of the articles we posted here is just an attempt to try to talk about what you are doing. And I loved how they opened the story by saying, in some respects, your podcast takes a little bit out of PragerU. And of course, we've had Dennis Prager in studio, and a lot of the PragerU videos have done well. And what you're trying to do now is, in some respects, educate people about material that we used to teach in the schools, but we don't teach anymore. We used to teach in the universities, but all this politically correct education has eliminated that. So kudos for doing that. But talk a little bit more about what's in this podcast and where you see it going in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, it's fallen out of fashion to study Western culture and civilization without apologizing for it. And that is a tremendous sorrow to me. You know, I loved my time at university, but more and more I feel as if there is this mind virus going around that basically teaches people that if all your authors are white men, then you can't possibly study them. I mean, back in 2016 at Yale, they decolonized the English department, meaning that they didn't want to read as many white male authors. And I just think that's a ridiculous way to go about trying to learn from the past. If you study the past by judging it according to the standards of the present, that just makes you stupid and prevents you from really learning from other people and other times. So I started Young Heretics because I wanted to offer people the classical education that our academies of higher learning are denying them. I mean, this is something, it sounds rarefied. It sounds like something you can maybe only do if you're, very fancy. But in fact, this classical education and an education in the West is, as you say, something that should be everybody's birthright. It used to be everybody's birthright. We have these treasures of literature and philosophy and history that can teach us wisdom for how to live at any time, especially a troubled time like ours. So that's what we do on the show. Every week we just dig deep into some of this treasure that exists for all of us.
You know, and when I think about it, we've had programs that we've done on classical Christian education, the importance of the classics, the importance of various reading and all of the rest. But it doesn't have to be something that only individuals that have the kind of degrees that you have, because you've even had individuals say, look, you know, I'm a fireman and nobody told me I could read Shakespeare or Milton. And so we are almost getting a bifurcated society. Some that are taking the time to read the great literature of Western culture and to learn about that. And they can do so through YouTube videos and by going just to even a used bookstore and getting some of those books. And then, of course, we have a whole generation learning classical Christian education, or maybe even in the private schools learning that. And then you have this mass of functional illiteracy, cultural illiteracy, and biblical illiteracy. So it's kind of interesting to see where we're headed here in the 21st century.
That's absolutely right. You know, the kind of reviews that you're mentioning for Young Heretics are my favorite kind of reviews. I absolutely love when people come to me, and it's happening more and more now, and they just say, you know, I didn't have a fancy education, I didn't go to a fancy college, but I just thought that this sort of thing was only for eggheads and academics, and now I really feel like it's accessible. Socrates is accessible to me. The Bible is accessible in a way that it wasn't before. And that really warms my heart, because, look, it should be the job of guys like me, guys that went and got advanced degrees, to bring the wisdom of the past into the present in a way that people can delight in and learn from and grow from. But as you say, that idea has basically been wiped out of our culture on purpose by mostly sort of Soviet Marxists that decided they were going to make this long march through the institutions, they called it, and deprive us of our heritage by making us ashamed of it. And so people now feel like they can't take ownership of guys like Shakespeare or Milton or Homer because there's something wrong or chauvinistic about it. And that, to me, is just death. It's spiritual and intellectual death, and you're seeing the effects of it out in the streets. You know, these folks that are rioting and, you know, tearing down statues, they're not doing that because they know what they're about. They're doing that because they've been tragically deprived of their heritage, and that kind of miseducation is criminal. I mean, Jesus said, right, anyone who mistreats one of these little ones, it would be better if a millstone were hung around his neck. It's a serious business, you know, educating young minds and shaping young souls. And I think the left has really done a terrible disservice to our population in this way.
I think you're also counter-programming against Twitter and trying to say things in 140 or 280 characters or something like that. I think people are getting pretty tired of all that, aren't they?
Yeah, what's so fascinating in the podcasting world is that you kind of think from Twitter and from writing for the internet that these little bite-sized pieces of information are what people want, and that's what draws clicks. But the podcasts that are most successful out there is guys like Joe Rogan, who basically just sit down and talk for 2 hours, 3 hours. And absolutely, and that was some of the feedback we got on our earlier episodes is, you know, love the show. It could be longer. I wish it were longer. So I am delighted to spend more time kind of marinating in this stuff. And it does take time and multiple revisits to get to the heart of some of the deepest works. So it's really wonderful to be in a format where people are hungry for more.
Let me pick out a couple of the episodes after the break, and we'll give people an understanding of that. We have a link to Young Heretics. You can find it at Apple or the variety of other venues where that takes place. We just have the one at Apple, but you can certainly find it through whatever platform that you use. And then we also have this article that appeared that just gives you a little bit of an overview. Spencer Klavan takes a stand against woke academia, and it really gets you into a little more of that interview and also some of the perspectives. So let's take a break, and we'll come back and talk about a couple of the episodes that have already been covered and where it's going in the future. Just thought it would be a great opportunity for you to learn in a way that maybe you felt that you weren't educated properly, whether it was in high school or college or even graduate school, and this is a way to supplement that education. And I think you will appreciate what Spencer brings to the table, and we'll talk about that with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The me start with an important question. Should teachers be considered essential workers? Over the last few months, we have designated police officers and firefighters, along with doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals as essential workers. We've even designated grocery workers, delivery drivers, food processors, and truck drivers as essential. These people, and many others we could list, went to their jobs every day. Some complained, but most considered the potential risks and did what they could to prevent catching the coronavirus. We owe these people a tremendous debt of gratitude. By contrast, lots of public school teachers and the teachers' unions are resisting any attempt to reopen the schools. There have been petitions and even protests. That's why most schools will be closed this fall. We closed down school systems months ago because we assumed that children would be the most vulnerable group during a pandemic. We now know that children are the least vulnerable to the virus. The American Academy of Pediatricians advocated that schools have a goal of having students physically present in schools. The New England Journal of Medicine warns that children living in poverty, children of color, English language learners, children with diagnosed disabilities, and young children face especially severe losses. Will some teachers be more at risk than others if schools reopen? That's possible, but one survey found that only 17% of public school teachers are in the vulnerable age range of 55 or older. This could be managed. Public schools in other countries in Europe and in Australia have been able to do this successfully. For years, we've been told that educating the next generation is essential. So why shouldn't governors, mayors, and school administrators designate teachers as essential workers? It is a question I suggest you ask them, especially during this election season. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I suspect you probably just want to sit back and listen for another few minutes, but if you have a question or a comment, we certainly do welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. And Spencer Klavan with us. Of course, we're talking about his podcast, Young Heretics. I thought I'd first of all mention the trailer because I love that. Culture Without the Culture Wars. Is reading Shakespeare racist? Is it too exclusive to study Homer? What about this idea of identity politics? So even before you started your podcast, you recognized you almost had to have an apologetic for why to do it in the first place, didn't you?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think that's true. One of the traps that conservatives tend to fall into, and not even just conservatives, but people that reject identity politics, is that we spend so much time defending the great works of the West that we forget to actually read them. And so much time defending Homer that we don't have time to get into it. And I think that that's a mistake. These people who believe that it's racist or sexist to read Homer, or it's you can't read Shakespeare because he's a white man, they're fools. And there's no point in arguing in fools. Arguing with fools just it's bad for the soul. It gets you sidetracked. And so the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to shrug them off as quickly as possible. And I do spend time on the show, refuting the identity politics arguments. But mostly I do that so that people don't have to have them in the back of their mind while we're just getting into the richness of the truth. C.S. Lewis, the great Christian apologist, said at one point, a man can't always be defending the truth. There must be a time to feed on it. That's the idea of the show.
Well, and you anticipated my next question because episode 5 was the greatest intellectual of the 20th century, and that was C.S. Lewis. And again, you bring to the program and to the discussion, the fact that a lot of people know him for Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, or they think about him for Mere Christianity, or whatever it might be. But, he was a war veteran, and that movie that came out recently that hardly anybody watched, and a couple of others remind us of the impact that Tolkien had on his life, the impact that the war had in his life, and a variety of other issues. And so, in some respects, even though he may be a familiar character to probably most of the listeners to Point of View, you still bring some insights that I think many people would really benefit from by listening to that podcast.
Well, one of the things that I say on that episode is that even people who love Lewis are a little bit anxious to kind of claim him as a great thinker or a great mind. And I believe that the reason for that is that he's very easy to read and understand. It's not that he doesn't have big ideas, it's that he's very good at expressing them in a clear and cogent way. And one of the prejudices that academics tend to have is that smart people have to be incomprehensible. You have to be talking in these very, high-flown terms in order to be saying anything worthwhile. But in fact, the opposite is true. Lewis was able to communicate so clearly because he had grappled at a very deep level with some of the central problems of his day, mostly having to do with Sigmund Freud and Darwin, whom he almost never mentions by name. It's really interesting in his work. That
it is, yes.
He's almost always, he says in Surprised by Joy that he had a sort of big encounter with Freud and his work in his early 20s, but that then he sort of went on to argue against the premises of Freudianism and Darwinism, which are basically premises of materialism, the idea that everything is just physical stuff and there's no spirit. Lewis's whole career was about disproving that idea, and he did it with reference to the great traditions of Greek antiquity. He was a classicist, he studied the ancient world, but he did so with this very light touch, so people tend to miss him, I think, as in my view, the great defender of the Western tradition in the 20th century.
Well said. Let me pick out another one, and that was Manhood and the Fall of Civilization for a couple of reasons. First of all, we've talked about this, the feminization of masculinity, the criticism from the feminists. Also, more recently, they had the Promise Keepers event, which ended up having to be a virtual event. So this is a topic we've talked about. We've had guests on the program talking about the war against boys. But in a sense, going back and looking at things like at the Roman Republic, we can learn some lessons that we really need to learn today here in the 21st century, don't you think?
I completely agree. I mean, here's a little story, a little known story from the 500s BC, so back in the classical period of Greece. In Cumae, which was a colony, there was a tyrant who wanted to make sure that nobody would ever rise against him. And the way he did that is he took the children of the nobility and all male children and schooled them as if they were girls. He sort of, made them sing pretty songs and wear flowing gowns and wear their hair long, because he knew that masculinity, this sort of essential force that the Greeks called thumos, of courage and spiritedness and just daring do, he knew that that was the greatest threat to tyranny that perhaps exists in the world. And I believe very strongly that that's part of the war on boys today. I think that the period of Roman history that I talk about in that episode gets at some of the same issues. The Roman state had just become so kind of tired and gridlocked that there was nowhere for ambitious young men to go except to become demagogues. And so they basically ended up destroying the state because they just had all this pent-up energy that had been denied. And that, I think, is something that we're going to be seeing a lot of if we keep buying into this sort of radical feminism.
Yeah, and that certainly is the case, and almost seeing toxic masculinity and all the rest. But I wanted to pick up one more because episode 12 was about the issue of freedom, and I'd be remiss if I didn't let Spencer talk a little bit about the cancel culture and about the attack on religious liberty and the attack on freedom. Matter of fact, tomorrow we'll talk about religious liberty because we'll have Kelly Shackelford in here, but just this whole attack on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, that is so part of the Western culture, and it's under attack like never before, isn't it?
It certainly is, and it is a bedrock of our society. We can't have any of the other debates that we all want to have unless we are free to speak our minds. And that is something in that episode, which is episode 12 on Milton, I talk about the fact that this is something which tends to happen when a new medium comes into play. So when the printing press came around, suddenly there were all these pamphlets and newspapers came into being and this tremendous flurry of activity. And some people, when that happens, their first reaction is to shut it down, because speech is powerful and speech is dangerous to people who want to retain their own grip on authoritarianism and power. And that's what cancel culture is. It's the new version of that in the online digital age. Now that we have this huge space for people to be talking and sharing ideas, the cancel culture left just wants that to be shut down, because they know that if you let the freedom out of the bag, then people start to think for themselves. And the only way, in my opinion, unfortunately, to counteract this is to elect Republicans up and down the ticket. I wish that weren't so. I wish that Americans of all stripes agreed upon this, but they don't. And so we've really got to focus on this election for that reason.
And maybe read Milton as well. And that's something you talk about in that podcast as well. Well, Spencer,
Indeed.
I am hoping that this is not the only conversation we have with you. I hope that we maybe can call on you from a regular basis. Appreciate the podcast, appreciate your insight, and I've enjoyed reading you. And by the way, I've really enjoyed reading your father over these years, so we appreciate you both, and anything we can do to help promote this, we wanted to do so. So that's why I wanted to get you on today, and tell people that if they click on the picture that we have of you right now, that's easy enough, where the website is, and then underneath we have an article about that. And so for those of you that take the time to watch or read or listen to podcasts or articles, this is something I thought you'd like to know about. And so, Spencer, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm so grateful. Thank you very much, Kerby. I'd love to come back.
Let's take a break. When we come back, let me take a couple of issues that relate. One, why is America in danger? Dennis Prager talks about that. That's one of the articles I've posted. We have a little bit more on Senator Kamala Harris, if for no other reason than just to help you understand that when the Associated Press and even New York Times says that she is a centrist, she is a moderate, or pragmatic moderate was what the New York Times said, I'll just give you some very good evidence to show that's not true, and that's why you need to read widely, and even maybe read this particular article we've posted, and then follow the links. Don't trust me, read it for yourself. That's why we put these kinds of things up there. And if you find yourself in a discussion or an argument with somebody about that, these are the kinds of things that we do post on the website for you to read. Let's take a break, though. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the individuals that you have been interviewing today, that is all available at our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to find the links to the articles that I'll be mentioning in just a minute, that's available at the website pointofview.net. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to hear it again, or maybe pass it on to someone else, we have a button that says listen, so you can download that as a podcast if you'd like, or you can watch it, and also, of course, you can go to the YouTube channel later and follow it. So we've just tried to provide you with a lot of resources and encourage you to take this and multiply it by sending whatever we talk about today to others that need to know about it. All of it available at our website, pointofview.net. And as we go through the summer, I think it would be really good if at least a few of you might recognize that during the summer, sometimes that's when our financial needs are the greatest. So if you can help us out by clicking on that button, that would be helpful too. Let's take a break. We'll explain, in light of the new research, why some people, when they get COVID-19, suffer more than others. I think we have some answers to that, and then we'll get into some of these philosophical and political issues right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. As program note, tomorrow, of course, is our Friday weekend edition, and that will be Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. And as you might imagine, we have a lot to talk about. Getting you ready for the Democratic Convention next week, and then the Republican Convention the week after. Both of those will be virtual. They won't be anything like they were before, but they are still significant. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the decision that was made to put the senator from California on the ticket, because when we talk about Senator Kamala Harris, we are talking about somebody who has been described as left of center, or a moderate, or a pragmatic moderate, or a person that has a centrist record, none of which is true, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Let me, before we get to the piece by Dennis Prager, just give you an update on the pandemic. We're still trying to figure all of this out, and I'll be the first to admit that this answer may be still something you want to hold lightly, but it seems pretty intriguing, and that is this new article that was published in Science magazine, which has been quoted by Dr. Anthony Fauci and others, seems to suggest now that maybe we have at least part of an answer for why COVID-19 strikes some people harder than others. Now, I think the first answer to that is not in this article I'm reading from, but we've mentioned before, there are different strains of this COVID-2 particular virus. And so this coronavirus is, in some respects, mutated a little bit, and so some hook onto the lungs differently or more effectively, so that may be part of it. But this more recent study that appeared in Science magazine seems to suggest that maybe immunity varies based on your previous experience with other coronaviruses. I'll just read one of the paragraphs. The study found that the immune systems of roughly half of its subjects appeared to remember past exposure to other prevalent coronaviruses, including variants of the common cold, equipping them to respond more quickly to COVID-19 infection once it appeared. The study, which was actually funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is actually the organization that Dr. Anthony Fauci heads up, was the first to identify, now let me get technical for just a second, T-cell cross-reactivity. Okay, that's the most technical we're going to get about this. T-cells, if you are not familiar, are cells which originate in the thymus, which is where they get their name. And they're kind of like a secondary line of defense. Some people have said, if you want to think about it, your first line of defense would be your antibodies, which would prevent the virus from getting in. That's kind of your first line of defense. That might be your infantry, if you will. But then some people have said that the T cells are kind of like the cavalry, and they come riding in. And so if you use that, the point that Dr. Fauci said, it's sort of like a 1-2 punch. It's conceivable that T cells that you've made in response a couple of years ago to whatever it might have been. It could have been the common cold. It could have been one of these endemic coronavirus strains like SARS or MERS or something like that. When you were exposed to that, that might actually hang around. And it turns out that we also recognize that while antibody immunity kind of fades a little bit faster, T cells last longer, but they don't last forever. So that might be another explanation, because as we have seen, I've had friends, and you have probably had friends too, that have had COVID-19, and they said, it's kind of like the common cold. Wasn't that bad at all. But then you know other people that had to be hooked up to a ventilator or had to go to an ICU. And so maybe we have an answer for some of that, and we'll see where that takes us in the next couple of weeks and months. Let me come to one of the articles. It's the first article I have listed on the website, and it's a very good article by Dennis Prager. Came out a couple of days ago, and sometimes it seems like every time I turn around, I'm quoting from Dennis Prager. Well, first of all, I like Dennis Prager. Second of all, he really brings great insight. And I kind of set this aside, and I came back and said, no, this really needs to be covered. And the reason for it is that he's pointed out in the opening part of his article that Americans have really been proud of the fact that, unlike, say, what happens in Europe, America never really went down the road of totalitarianism, which you see surfaced in communism, fascism, Nazism. He said that achievement may come to an end, and we'll leave that for a minute. But the point he's making is after World War I, what oftentimes gives meaning is, first of all, Judeo-Christian religion in general, but especially the Judeo-Christian philosophy in Western Europe, and patriotism, love of one's nation. Well, after World War I, religion was deemed as unnecessary, really being attacked, especially in some of the German intellectual fields, but elsewhere as well. And national identity was set aside because it was widely seen as the cause of the war. So this left an incredible void, which was filled with communism. Let's look at what happened in the Russian Revolution after World War I, or fascism, look what happened in Italy, or Nazism, and look what happened in Germany. Now, he goes into that in some detail, but I skip over it because I would assume that should be pretty obvious to most of you. And then he points out that did not happen in the United States. I'll quote from him again. Americans did not lose their faith in Judeo-Christian religions and values of or in America after World War I. America remained so religious that in 1954, the words under God were inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, which was recited daily in American schools. And so then he points out, though, that by the time you get into the 1950s, there was still faith in America, there was still faith in Christianity, and there was still a lot of middle-class values, but they were more limited to the older Americans. The post-World War II baby boom generation began to challenge all of that. We're being indoctrinated in secularism and anti-Americanism. And so by the time you get to the late 1960s, you had demonstrations against America. He talks about his own experience at Columbia University. We won't go into all of that. But it brings me to the point he's making. And he said, we now have an answer to the question, what will happen to America if Americans lose faith in God and country, as Europeans did after World War I? What will happen to America when Christianity dies, as it did in Europe after World War I? I think we know the answer. We already are starting to see more of a push towards totalitarianism. And he gives some examples, from his own experience of testifying in front of Congress about the fact that even back then there were 100 PragerU videos that were put on a restricted list with Google. Talks about last week PragerU locked out their Twitter account because they retweeted a press conference of these physicians, which I talked about in one of my commentaries. Then there's cancel culture, where people are booted from various platforms. And even now, the desire for various individuals in the mob, mostly the leftist mob, to force people to issue public recantations of their beliefs and attend re-education sessions. Now, he says we don't have re-education camps like you have in China, but maybe that could happen in the future. And then even just a redefinition and a rewriting of the American past. And he reminds us of one of the jokes that some of the Soviet dissidents used. In the Soviet Union, the future is known. It is the past that's always changing, and that is to simply remove it. So, again, Dennis Prager is looking at this kind of as an Orthodox Jew. I look at it as an evangelical Christian and say, if nothing else, this becomes one more argument for why we need a revival in America. Not just the fact that we need to share the gospel, as we were talking about in the first hour with Sean Dunn. That's reason enough. But if we don't have some kind of religious revival, if we don't have a establishment of Judeo-Christian and moral values, you can see that the march towards totalitarianism takes place. Now, will it result in fascism or Nazism? No. Will it result even early in communism? Not really. It will probably surface with more of a sort of a socialist, kind of totalitarian, heavy-handed action, which brings us to something we'll talk about after the break, because when you have various people in the media portraying the vice presidential nominee, at least the presumptive vice presidential nominee, Senator Kamala Harris, as a moderate, you know, first of all, they're not telling the truth. But second of all, when you start going through, as we do in one of these articles, all the views that she holds to, it's been a remarkable change in this whole particular strategy, because my third article on the website, which I won't mention much after the break, comes from Ben Shapiro, who simply reminds us that up until now, Joe Biden has had a strategy: be non-threatening, stay in the basement, play defense against President Donald Trump. But once you bring on somebody as radical as Senator Kamala Harris, non-threatening is sort of flown out the window. And we'll talk more about what her views are and what that might mean for the campaign right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Just real quickly, I might just mention that the second article we've posted here today is one that even I cited a little bit earlier on another broadcast, and I had people come in and say, there's information I'd never heard here before. So let me give credit where credit is due. Joshua Lawson is the managing editor of The Federalist, and this comes from an article in The Federalist, and it's simply entitled, "No, Kamala Harris isn't a moderate. She's a radical threat to America." Now, the reason he felt the need to do that is, as we mentioned even yesterday, the New York Times characterized Senator Harris as a pragmatic moderate. And then you had some others writing for the New York Times saying that both Harris and Biden are two moderates who share center-left politics. You have the Associated Press that actually talked about the centrist record of Senator Kamala Harris. Now, our listeners out there in California know what I'm talking about, but recognizing that we're now introducing her to the entire nation, let's, if we can, give some accurate facts. Yesterday, you might have actually heard the interview we did with our good friend Tim Wildman, who is the president of American Family Association, and in passing, he mentioned that she's the fourth most liberal senator. I have in front of me here, and you can read this for yourself, that actually she is the most liberal senator, sharing that position with Senator Elizabeth Warren, if you want to use the assessment that comes from VoteView. Now, again, you can look at different ways to evaluate people's votes. And I recognize that for some people it doesn't matter. I mean, 12 years ago, we pointed out that Senator Barack Obama had one of the most liberal voting records. And a lot of people said, I don't care. And so maybe you listen to this and say, you don't care. Okay, I understand that. But if you are trying to make the case that she is not a moderate and challenge the views that have been expressed by the Associated Press and New York Times, and I don't take that lightly because these are reputable various organizations, then you really need to have some facts. And this fourth paragraph is one that I would commend to you for that alone, but we'll give you some specifics in just a minute. And that is, Senator Harris has a voting record further to the left than 97% of Democrats in the 116th Senate, and more liberal than 99% of the Senate as a whole. Of the current members of the U.S. Senate, some have left now, of course, Senator Harris ranks more liberal than Senator Bernie Sanders. I don't even know how that happens. I got to go look at those votes. While placing as the Democrat with the most liberal voting record in the chamber, aside with Senator Elizabeth Warren. So, more liberal than any other Democrat you could find, more liberal than Senator Bernie Sanders. Does that give you any idea? Okay, you might say, okay, I want some specifics. Okay, let's look at some specifics. Each one of these are paragraphs which have links, so you can follow those links. For example, Senator Harris has stated on more than one occasion that people that are here illegally are not criminals. And so, again, the idea of illegal immigrant, that's why, of course, they like to use the phrase undocumented immigrants right off the bat. She also has likened the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers, to members of the Ku Klux Klan. You might say, oh, I got to see that one for myself. Okay, well, last night I noticed that Tucker Carlson played it, and you can find this link and watch it yourself. Come to your own conclusion. Okay, during the Democratic primary, this one's not even up for grabs, when they were having the Democratic primary debates, one of the questions was, do you support government-run health care plans for everyone, including illegal immigrants? Of course, she raises her hand. Then there's an interview that she did with CNN's Jake Tapper. I again watched that one last night online, but again, this gives you a link in which she says, I'm opposed to any policy that would deny anyone public access to public safety, public education, public health, period. So again, matter of record. Now, you might want to say, well, I misspoke. Okay, but I don't think anybody's making that statement right now. I just gave you the voting record. I just gave you some of the statements. You can learn a lot about where people are by votes. You can talk all day, but when it comes down to a vote, yay or nay, that's important. The other way to evaluate a candidate is what legislation have they sponsored? Well, Senator Kamala Harris has actually sponsored the Green New Deal. If you've listened to this program, you know all the concerns we would have about the cost and the environmental damage, not to mention economic damage of the Green New Deal. And when you challenge the issue of environmental damage, you get back to some of the conversation we've had more recently with some of the authors of books like Apocalypse Never and all the rest. She was a co-sponsor of Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All scheme, which would again be the step towards socialized healthcare system. She's on record for wanting to repeal all of the tax cuts that were implemented in 2017. So those are a couple of obvious ones. Let's take a few more. During the debate, you might remember that she and the now presumptive presidential nominee, former Vice President Joe Biden, went back and forth about whether or not she could even constitutionally do what she proposed, and that is promise that if she was elected president, she would sign an executive order banning all of these so-called assault weapons, AR-15s, AK-47, and high-capacity magazines. Of course, Joe Biden said you can't do that constitutionally, and she just laughed at it, and all sorts of other issues that I can get into in terms of Second Amendment, but let's continue on. How about a couple more? Energy. You know, she has already stated that she's in favor of banning both fracking and offshore drilling, which has given us energy independence, and actually proposed all sorts of energy policies, which would be quite dramatic. And again, every one of these have links so you can go and read it for yourself to see what she has been saying. And then she even has an interesting plan on abortion. Okay, let's recognize there's no way that you can run in the Democratic primary without being completely pro-abortion. Got that. Figured that out a long time ago. But she goes one step further, not only abortion till birth, but she also has proposed a plan where somehow, I'm not even sure how you could do this, it would force states and local jurisdictions to seek prior approval and clearance through the U.S. Department of Justice before you could place any limit or restriction on abortion. It'd be like 24-hour waiting period, informed consent, whatever those might be. And so for some of you, you might say, well, she's only the vice president. And the piece that I posted, it's the third article here by Ben Shapiro, reminds us that usually the vice presidential pick means little or nothing. Vice presidency is uniquely powerless office, and presidents rarely hand power over to vice presidents. I think one obvious exception was George W. Bush, with, of course, his vice president. But nevertheless, getting back to this article that I just quoted from by Joshua Lawson, he says, given Joe Biden's age, he would be 78 on Inauguration Day, the odds are greater than normal that Senator, at this point, Senator, at that time, she'd be Vice President Kamala Harris would be called upon to fulfill the primary and solemn duty for which the vice presidency exists, and that is to be sitting behind the desk at the Oval Office. It's very clear that Joe Biden would not be running again because he would be 81 by the next election, and I think you can kind of figure out by the time he would be elected, he would be 82, and I don't think anybody would be electing him. So there is a sense in which he's already being seen as, if not the president next year, probably the president in less than 4 years. So those are just a couple of facts that we wanted to put on the table, and I would encourage you to read them and pass them on to others so that we can really educate people in the light of how some of that has been sadly misrepresented by the mainstream press. That's all we have for today. Let me just mention that tomorrow is our weekend edition, and I certainly want to, as always, thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, and I also want to thank Steve for his help as a producer. Hope you've enjoyed the conversation today. If you would like some more information, you can find it on the website at pointofview.net, and we'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View on our weekend edition.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.